One pain, one truth.
The day my mother died, what haunted me wasn't that the house had suddenly lost a person. It was the brass key she was clutching so tightly in her hand that I had to pry her stiff fingers open one by one to get it out. No one in the family knew what that key unlocked. Only the doctor standing beside her bed, speaking so softly I had to lean in to hear, told me that right before she passed, she kept repeating the same sentence over and over, mumbling as if she was afraid she wouldn't have time to finish it. There's still one person who doesn't know the truth. I stood there frozen, my hand still warm from holding hers, thinking it was nothing more than the rambling of someone at the end of her strength. I was wrong. After the funeral, the house still smelled of incense. But the very next evening, I caught my sister-in-law inside my father's office, flipping through a stack of documents. The moment she saw me, she quickly closed them and forced a smile, saying she was looking for an insurance file. I didn't ask any questions. But from that point on, I started noticing the quick glances my father and my older brother exchanged whenever anyone mentioned words like divide or hand over. Exactly 1 week after the funeral, the family gathered for a meeting. My father sat at the head of the table, his back straight as though nothing had happened. My brother sat on his right, while my sister-in-law had already prepared a thick folder, every section marked with yellow sticky notes, the kind that only appeared after someone had spent night after night putting it together. My father announced that he would transfer full control of the workshop to my brother starting the following month. No one asked what I thought. I almost spoke up, opened my mouth, then stopped. Anything I said would sound like I was fighting over the business right after my mother's funeral. Just as everyone was about to sign the meeting record, an elderly woman walked in. She didn't knock. No one invited her. She was wearing faded work clothes and holding a small wooden box tightly against her chest, its corners worn smooth as if it had been gripped inside a bag for a very long journey. I recognized her immediately. She had managed the raw materials warehouse when I was little and hadn't been seen at the workshop in over 10 years. She set the box on the table, breathing heavily as though she'd walked a long way. She told me not to bring this until today. My father froze in the middle of signing. His pen stopped moving. For the first time since my mother's death, I saw his expression change. It wasn't grief. It looked more like someone who had just seen something he buried long ago suddenly rise back into daylight. Take it back. His voice stayed steady, but he gripped the pen so hard his knuckles turned white. The woman ignored him and pushed the box toward me. She said only the person holding the key is allowed to open it. Everyone at the table looked down at my hand. I went still, my heart pounding. The key in my pocket fit the lock perfectly, so perfectly it couldn't possibly have been a coincidence. My father shot to his feet and reached for the box, but the woman pulled it back. I'm sorry. I made her a promise. Then she turned and walked away before anyone could stop her. The room fell completely silent. I didn't open the box right then, not because I was calm, but because my hands were shaking so badly I was afraid I'd drop it. My brother walked past me with an awkward smile and said it was probably just a few keepsakes. But even his voice cracked slightly, as though he was trying harder to reassure himself than me. That night, in my small apartment, I sat there for nearly an hour before I finally worked up the nerve to put the key into the lock. Inside there was no will, no property documents. Just an old notebook, a hand-drawn map, and a small folded note. The note contained only one line, written in my mother's increasingly shaky handwriting. Don't start with the workshop. I read it again and again. The more I read it, the colder I felt. If I wasn't supposed to start with the workshop, then where was I supposed to begin? The notebook said nothing about money or property. Every page contained only a name, a location, and a date, with no explanation. A paint supplier. A former truck driver. Someone who worked at a bank. None of them had anything to do with running the workshop. I almost called my father. I'd already dialed half his number before I locked my phone again. If my mother had wanted to tell me directly, she wouldn't have hidden everything inside a locked wooden box. The next morning I took the day off and went to the first address, an old watch repair shop tucked deep inside an alley. The owner stared at the photo of my mother on my phone for a long time, his hands completely still. He opened a drawer, took out a yellowed envelope, but kept holding it without handing it over. I thought she'd come back for it herself. I told him I was her son. He stayed quiet for a few seconds, then slowly shook his head. No. She said I could only give it to you if you found me on your own, not just because you told me who she was. Inside the envelope was an old photograph. My mother, my father, and 4 other people were standing in front of an empty piece of land. Behind them was a sign with the name of a cooperative that had been dissolved years ago. On the back, my mother had written only one sentence. This is where it all began. I had barely stepped outside when someone called my name from across the street. My brother was standing there. I had no idea how long he'd been following me. He didn't ask what I'd found. He only looked at the envelope and quietly said, "Stop digging." I asked him why. He lowered his head, his voice catching. For the first time in years, Dad's finally willing to hand things over to me. I'm afraid if everything gets stirred up, he'll change his mind. That was the first time I realized he might not know the whole truth, but he definitely knew more than he was willing to admit. It was also the first time I decided I wasn't going to stand on the sidelines anymore, even if I had to keep going alone. I drove to the piece of land in the photograph that very afternoon. The cooperative that had once stood there was now nothing more than a temporary parking lot, surrounded by brand new factory buildings. Every trace of the past had disappeared. The parking attendant told me the property had changed hands several times, with the paperwork passing through who knew how many companies. I stood there for a long time, comparing every tree and every remaining section of old wall with the picture in my hand. Only one giant banyan tree was still standing in the exact same spot, as if it alone still remembered what had happened there. There was a small drink stand beneath the tree. The elderly woman running it squinted at the photo for a long while before asking if I was Linda's son. I was so startled I nearly dropped my phone. She told me my mother used to come there often. Every time, she'd simply sit facing the land, drink a cup of tea, then leave without saying much. Once, the woman overheard her murmuring to herself, "Some things have to be found even after they're gone. Otherwise, someone else will lose even more." I asked whether she remembered anyone else in the picture. She shook her head. The only thing she remembered was a man who walked with a slight limp in his left leg. That detail stopped me cold. It immediately brought Uncle Tom to mind, the man who used to drive lumber for our workshop when I was little. He'd quit more than 10 years ago after an accident no one had ever properly explained. I went to his house, but it was locked. A neighbor told me he'd moved into a care facility a few weeks earlier. I got back in my car that same afternoon, afraid that if I waited even one more day, I'd lose another lead the way I already had before. Uncle Tom looked much older than I'd imagined. Most of his hair had turned white, and his hands trembled as he held my phone to look at the photograph. He didn't seem surprised. He only asked one question, in the tone of someone who had been waiting a very long time to ask it. "So, she finally let you come looking?" I was about to ask about the picture, but he raised a hand to stop me. "Before you ask me anything, answer one question first." He looked straight into my eyes. "If you learn the truth, do you want to keep your family, or do you want to win?" I couldn't answer. The question was simple, but it struck a place I'd never dared examine, because the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted either. I stumbled through a few words before falling silent. He gave me a sad smile and handed the photograph back. "If you can't answer that yet, then you're not ready to know." I walked out of his hospital room feeling hollow. For the first time, I realized not everyone was willing to help me, even someone who seemed to have been on my mother's side. That night my father called me. It was the first time he'd done that since I moved out. "Come to the workshop tomorrow." "For what?" "There's a meeting." "I don't work there anymore." "Tomorrow you do." He hung up before I could ask another question. When I arrived the next morning, everyone was already there. My father introduced a major new project, then unexpectedly assigned me to oversee the site assessment. My brother looked at me, his expression caught somewhere between suspicion and confusion. I didn't understand what my father was trying to do either. After the meeting, my sister-in-law pulled me into the hallway. Her voice was quiet but sharp. "Things between you brothers are finally peaceful. Don't let old stories ruin that." I recognized immediately that it wasn't advice. She was testing me. I only gave a faint smile. "I don't even know what those old stories are yet." She watched me for another few seconds before walking away, her pace just a little faster than usual. For the next 3 days, my father kept giving me urgent assignments, each one requiring me to be at the workshop from early morning until late at night. At first I thought he genuinely wanted me back. Then on the 4th day, I sat down and opened my mother's notebook again. That's when I realized the next 3 names in the notebook all corresponded exactly to those same 3 days that had just passed. I froze. He wasn't bringing me back. He was making sure I didn't have time to keep searching. I asked a friend to swap shifts with me. During the day I still showed up at the workshop so my father wouldn't suspect anything, and every evening I rushed off to meet the people listed in the notebook. Some nights I didn't get home until nearly midnight. The second person was the owner of an old paint shop, a thin man whose slow voice sounded as though he'd told this story to himself countless times but had never spoken it aloud. He didn't hand me any documents. He only talked. 20 years earlier, the woodworking shop had nearly gone bankrupt because of a defective shipment. Someone suggested blaming an entire group of workers so the company could keep a major contract. My mother strongly opposed the idea. My father agreed to it. In the end, the workers all quit. Some even left the area and never came back. I asked what any of that had to do with the present. He answered even more slowly. "Don't spend all your time trying to figure out who was right. Figure out who became afraid of the truth from that day on." I typed those words into my phone with slightly trembling hands. I got home very late that night. The apartment door was already unlocked. My brother was waiting in the living room. On the table lay my mother's notebook, the one I'd kept hidden inside a locked drawer. I stopped in my tracks. "You used my spare key?" He nodded without denying it. "I'm sorry." "Why would you do that?" "I just wanted to know what you were looking for." "Well, did you find anything?" He lowered his head and admitted he'd read a few pages. I was angry, not so much because he'd opened the notebook, but because I could see he was genuinely shaken, the kind of confusion that comes from stumbling onto something you never expected. He took an envelope out of his pocket and said someone had delivered it to the workshop that morning with my name on it. Inside was a single typed page. No signature. No return address. "Stop now. You won't get to meet the next person." I looked at him and asked if he'd sent it. He immediately shook his head. The reaction was so firm that I believed him. But what chilled me far more than the message itself was the fact that whoever sent it knew exactly that I was following my mother's notebook. Someone had been watching every step I took all along. The next morning I went to the next address in the notebook. The house was locked up tight, strangely silent. A neighbor told me the owner had sold the house and moved away just the day before. No one knew where, almost as if they'd known someone was coming. I stood in front of the closed door for a long time, the threatening note still sitting in my pocket. It was the first time since I began this search that I'd truly lost a lead with no way to recover it. It was also the first time I understood that the path my mother left behind wasn't some neatly prepared trail waiting for me to follow. Someone was deliberately staying one step ahead, erasing every trace just as I reached it. I didn't return to the workshop. Instead, I drove straight back to the hospital to see Uncle Tom again. My mind was in complete chaos. I couldn't stop thinking about that locked door. The moment he saw me walk in, he knew something had happened. "Couldn't find them, could you?" I nodded, unable to get a single word past the lump in my throat. He let out a long sigh, staring out the window for a while. "Then they're afraid now too." I asked why everyone only ever spoke in half-truths, why no one would tell me the whole story. He answered slowly, his voice rough. "Because there are truths that, if you tell them at the wrong time, people will only think you're trying to blame someone else." I sat down beside his bed and told him that the last time we'd met, he'd asked whether I wanted to keep my family or win. Now I had an answer. He looked at me, waiting. "I want to know how my mother lived before she died. If the family survives after that, good. If it doesn't, then at least don't let her take that injustice with her." He nodded, sat quietly for a moment, then reached into the old bag he always carried with him. Inside wasn't a case file. It was an old attendance ledger with a worn spine. He flipped to a page filled with signatures and, with trembling fingers, pointed to one line. "The day that defective shipment happened, the people who were supposed to take the blame weren't the workers. Your mother signed for it herself so they wouldn't lose their jobs." I went completely still. But, she hadn't done anything wrong. That's right. She hadn't. Then why would she take the blame? Because your father said that if no one stepped forward, more than 30 families would lose their livelihood overnight. I stared at the faded signature, imagining my mother putting her name beneath a mistake that wasn't hers, just to protect everyone else. What happened after that? From that day on, almost everyone believed she was the one who ruined everything. She knew it, and never once tried to clear her name. In that moment I understood. My mother hadn't been forgotten. She had chosen to step into that forgotten place herself, accepting the blame for more than 20 years without ever defending herself. Uncle Tom took out one more small envelope and said my mother had asked him to keep it safe. Inside was a short letter, written more carefully than the note she'd left in the wooden box. "If one day my children learn the truth, don't try to prove that I was right. Find a way to make sure no one ever has to take the blame for someone else again." I folded the letter and gripped it so tightly it wrinkled in my hand. It wasn't evidence for me to use against anyone. It was what finally made me understand why my mother had left me such a winding journey instead of simply writing everything down in a will. That afternoon I returned to the workshop. The supervisors were in the middle of a tense meeting. A young worker stood in the center of the room with his head lowered, admitting responsibility for a shipment of lumber cut to the wrong dimensions. His hands were shaking, his eyes red as though he was about to cry. My father ordered someone to prepare an incident report immediately. I looked at the young man, and the image brought back everything Uncle Tom had told me about my mother. I asked to review the shipping paperwork. It took only a few minutes to discover that the mistake had started with the purchase order, not production. The approval signature belonged to a senior manager who was standing right there in the room. He fell silent. The young worker didn't dare say another word. My father kept staring at the report without looking up. I placed the two sets of documents side by side in front of him. He isn't the one who made the mistake. The room went completely silent. My father looked up at me, his eyes harder than I'd expected, as though he wasn't ready to watch history repeat itself in front of him again. He tried to brush it aside, saying they'd deal with it later. His voice remained firm. I didn't back down. If he takes the blame today, someone else will take the blame tomorrow. He stayed silent for a long time, his jaw tightening. It was obvious he didn't appreciate being challenged by his own son in front of everyone. The older manager slowly stood up and spoke in a barely audible voice. "I thought it'd be easier if he just took the blame. I never imagined it'd end up like this." No one said another word. Somehow that sentence made the room feel even heavier than my father's silence. My father closed the file and told everyone else to leave. Only the two of us remained. He sat there for a long time, rubbing his forehead, before finally speaking. His voice wasn't as hard as before. "Your mother did the same thing once." "I know. Uncle Tom told me." He looked up at me, exhaustion filling his eyes, as though he'd aged years in a single afternoon. I kept telling myself it was the only choice back then. But it wasn't, Dad. There were other choices. You just didn't choose them. He didn't answer. He simply sat there with both hands locked tightly together. I placed my mother's letter on the table without pushing it toward him. "I'm not going to make the past public." He looked at me, surprised. "But starting today, no one will ever take the blame for someone else again. If you let it happen one more time, I won't stay silent a second time." He picked up the letter and read it for a long time, his hand trembling slightly. Just as I stood to leave, he quietly called after me. "I never once asked how much your mother suffered." It was the first thing he'd said in years that wasn't an order. It was a confession. Things didn't suddenly become peaceful after that. It took my father nearly another month before he was willing to sit down with the management team and review the old cases. Some days he'd walk out of meetings halfway through and lock himself inside his office for the rest of the afternoon. A week later, he went on his own to visit one of the workers who'd been forced to leave years ago, the same man Uncle Tom had mentioned in the attendance book. The man was now in his 60s, living alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town. My father stood outside the gate for a long time before finally knocking. The man looked at him without inviting him in or sending him away. He simply stood in the doorway and listened until my father had said everything he came to say. When he finished, the man replied with only one sentence. "I'll accept your apology. But I don't need back pay, and I don't want my job back. I built a life without the workshop. If you really want to restore my dignity, then make sure this never happens to anyone else." My father stood outside that gate for a long time, unable to say another word, gripping the brim of his hat before quietly driving away. My brother didn't stop at apologizing either. He voluntarily stepped down from the major project and gave the position to a more experienced supervisor, even though it had been the opportunity he'd waited years for. He told me he needed time to relearn the difference between right and wrong before taking a position where he'd have to make decisions for other people. I never expected that. And somehow, it convinced me of his sincerity more than any apology ever could. Some nights, while sorting through the things inside my mother's wooden box, I'd suddenly remember an afternoon from long ago. I was still a little boy. My mother was carefully repairing a broken wooden toy. As she worked, she said, "When you grow up, you'll understand. Some broken things can't be fixed right away. They have to heal slowly if you want them to stay whole." Back then, I didn't know whether she was talking about the toy or something else. Looking back now, it still brings tears to my eyes. There were nights when I wanted to stop searching, to let everything sink back into silence so life would feel lighter again. But every time I came close to giving up, I remembered my mother's hand clinging to that brass key until her very last breath. A week later, my father invited every current and former employee to the workshop. There were no long speeches. He simply announced that from then on, every mistake would be investigated through the proper process, that no one would be blamed before the facts were confirmed, and that anyone who had been wrongly punished in the past would be invited back if possible or compensated according to what the workshop could afford. Some believed him. Others didn't. A few refused outright, saying they'd already built new lives and had no desire to reopen old wounds. I didn't try to persuade them. I understood that some wounds don't heal just because someone finally says the right words. A few months later, my father stepped away from running the workshop day to day. He didn't hand the position to any one person, not even my brother. Instead, he formed a management board so every major decision would be reviewed and challenged instead of resting in the hands of a single person. I continued working as a designer, returning to the workshop only a few days each week to help improve its procedures. Not because I wanted the position, but because I didn't want my mother's final letter to spend the rest of its life sealed inside an old envelope, unread and forgotten. Years later, people sometimes ask me what the most valuable thing my mother left behind was. It wasn't the key. It wasn't the notebook. It wasn't even the secrets she'd kept hidden for 20 years. It was a single question that has stayed with me ever since, forcing me to answer it every time I face a difficult choice, between comfort and doing what's right. What kind of person do I want to become?